Good morning. If you all take a seat, we're going to get started. Garrett's got a lot to present this morning. Okay. Last Sunday, Doug brought us a lesson on the culture during the Old Testament times and how women were treated then. Today, Garrett will do the same thing regarding the New Testament times and the culture influenced by the Roman occupation during that period of time. Regarding questions, we had a suggestion from the Corbys that we liked, and in order to stay on schedule, if you have any questions that don't get answered during class time, write them down and give them to the presenter or one of us. It may be that your question will be answered in subsequent classes. And if so, you can withdraw that question. But if your written question is one of a simple clarification, we will answer that by the next session. Otherwise, we'll save it until the last session for discussion, okay? So if you have any questions, they'll get answered, write them down, give them to Garrett today or me, and we'll either answer them as a matter of course, during some classes, or cover them at the last session. It was mentioned last Sunday, I'm going to read this, during the introduction that the elders have no agenda with this class, just a study of women's roles that was triggered by a question regarding women praying with men present in small groups such as house to house and teen devotionals. Although met with some skepticism, rest assured that the elders have no agenda other than to open the scriptures and ask the Holy Spirit to reveal to us what the Word has to say. That's the goal of every Bible study, including this one. That initial question regarding women praying with men present caused the elders to do an in-depth study on the women's roles in the church, and these classes are a result of that study. It is a timely study due to the sweeping changes in our current culture and in the rise of women in all sorts of leadership roles in our society. Because of that culture shift, we will no doubt be tested by those who champion women's rights, on the one hand, or those who would restrict the participation of women unnecessarily on the other hand. So we need to have a good understanding and be united in what the Scripture says about the relationship between men and women, husbands and wives, in the church and the home setting. So please keep in mind that the elders we meet every Thursday morning from 9:30 to 11:30, and so if you have any questions, comments, things to talk about, we're available. Just give us a call and we'll schedule it. Okay, Garrett, sorry it takes so much time.
All right. I want to thank you all for being here, for taking time to come to this. One of the things that happens when you ask a youth minister to lead your class time is you get some of his tendencies. Because, you see, I can't start a class without singing a song. So we're going to sing a song, and I'm going to need help because this may not be familiar to everyone in this room, but it is familiar to our youth group. It's one of their favorites. So we're just going to start off with this song, You Are Holy. And if you haven't heard it before, the men will lead, the women will echo, and then the chorus, it's a little confusing, but just follow as best as you can. So, let's sing. You are holy, and you are mighty, and you are worthy, worthy of praise, and I will follow, and I will listen, and I will love you all of my days, and I will sing to and worship the King who is worthy. I will love and adore him. I will bow down before him. I will sing to and worship the King who is worthy. me. I will love and adore him. I will bow down before him. You're my Prince of Peace, and I will live my life for you. All right, so I just have to start a class off with a song. And since, the teens have moved out to the teen center, I know Doug's class used to hear us singing in next door, and sometimes they would join along with us. So I just had to do that this week. Women in New Testament culture. My study this week is New Testament. Doug shared with us last week talking about women in Old Testament culture, Old Testament Jewish culture and the surrounding areas. I'm going to challenge you guys. I know last week Doug read his word for word, and I'm going to stick as close to mine as possible, but I'm going to encourage you to just listen right now. Don't try to read and listen at the same time, because our minds can't focus on two things at the same time. So it's actually more helpful if you listen now and then take what I've written out for you to read later. Okay, that way you get a double dose of this, and you can just hear, you can sit back, you can listen to what I'm saying, and then read it again later. So that's what I'm going to challenge you to do today. I'm not going to read this word for word. I'm going to stick as close to it as I can. But I think it's more beneficial for you if you just listen right now and hear what I have to say and what God has to say. But last week, Doug talked and shared with us what the Jewish culture in Old Testament times was like for women. And we looked at that. Today, we're going to be looking at women in the culture of the New Testament time. And they're very similar. There's a lot of similarities between Old Testament and New Testament Jewish culture, but there are two main differences, two different influences that came in between Old Testament and New Testament time. And those are the Greeks and the Romans. Okay? The Greeks and the Romans had a huge influence over the entire Mediterranean world. And the Greeks came in first. I mean, there were other people that ruled Jerusalem, that ruled Israel over those times, and we read about some of them in the Old Testament. When God punished the Israelites and sent them into exile, we read about some of these other conquerors that came in. We read about the Assyrians who came in around 722 and ruled till about 586 BC. We read about the Babylonians who took over from the Assyrians around 586 and ruled Israel from 5 till about 538. And then the Persians from 538 to 332 BC. So there were other rulers over Israel rather than just the Greeks and the Romans. But the Greeks and the Romans had such a huge influence. And we see it in our history books. We read all about the Greek culture. We read all about the Roman culture. And largely in part because of what the Greeks did when they took over a country. Okay, we read about Hellenization is what it's called. And when the Greeks would take over a country, they would move Greeks into that country, and they would spread their ideology into the midst of this foreign country. And so they would spread their religions. They would spread their language. They would spread their philosophy. And so when Alexander the Great, he conquers this large amount of land. He conquers basically the entire Mediterranean and moves out east. He carries with him that Greek culture. And it infects everything that it touches. And so you've got this huge influence of this Greek culture that has taken over the world. And for the most part, I mean, it's a good thing. The Greek culture was good. They valued education. They valued a lot of good things. Yeah, they spread their religion, which had all these other gods in there that we read about and we make movies about. But the Greek culture was very much based on education. And I like what Where did I say it? See, this is why you just got to stick with your script. But basically, the idea was that it wasn't where you were born that made you Greek. It was education that made you Greek. And so you could be born in a foreign country, you could be born in Israel, but your education would make you Greek. And so this Greek culture had this huge influence, and so much so we see it even in the Bible. We see, when Paul writes his letter to the Roman church, he says there's no distinction between Jew and Greek. Okay? This is after the Greeks' time. This is during the Roman occupation. Okay? He doesn't say there's no distinction between Jew and Roman. He says there's no distinction between Jew and Greek. The Greeks' influence lasted long after they were actually around. And so we see this in the way that Paul writes, in the way that Paul thinks that this Greek influence lasted well beyond their time. Hellenization, as I talked about, was largely successful as the people learned, adopted the language, religions, and culture of the Greeks. We see this clearly in the creation of what is called the Septuagint. Okay? The Septuagint was basically the Hebrew Old Testament translated into Greek. And so the story goes that Ptolemy II in 3rd century BC, he took 70 Jewish elders, sat them down to translate the Hebrew Torah into what is called Koine Greek. Okay, that was the Greek language at that time. And then he threatened their lives to do this. He didn't just say, would you please, translate this into Greek so everybody can read. No, he said, would you please do this or I'll murder you and your families. Okay, so he had these 70 elders sit down and translate the Hebrew Old Testament, the Hebrew Torah, into Greek. And so this Septuagint, as it was called, which you get that name from the 70 elders, or 72, depending on your translation, from the 70 elders that translated it. Septuagint, 7, you get it. Okay? This Septuagint was very influential in its time and beyond its time. Because a lot of these Christians that are sprouting up in the first century, they don't know Hebrew. They can't read Hebrew. They don't understand it. And so they do understand Greek. They do read Greek. And so they would have relied heavily on this Septuagint as written in a language they understand, written in a language that they are familiar with, that the Greeks have come in and indoctrinated into these different countries. The Septuagint was huge, especially among the Gentile Christians of the 1st and 2nd century. Okay? The Septuagint, we could talk, I could spend all my time talking about the Septuagint. I don't want to, but just for now, know that the Greek culture had such a huge influence on even the Jewish religion that this text came into existence during the pre-Christian era and was widely used by many early Christians. Now, when I say widely, no, it wasn't printed off anywhere. They didn't have the printing press yet, so not everybody had a copy of the Septuagint in their back pocket. But that is what they would have read when they read the Old Testament, is this Greek translation. After the Greeks, you get a brief rule of the Maccabees, which are, it's brief. It's mentioned in some intertestamental books. You get 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th Maccabees, which are not in our Bibles, but they make for an interesting read if you ever get a chance. Go read the Maccabees. But after the Maccabees, you get the Romans. Okay? And we all know that the Romans were in charge during the New Testament. Okay? During the writing of the New Testament, during Jesus' life, the Romans had a huge presence in Israel. And so after the Greeks came and influenced the culture around them, you get these Romans who come in, and they still have, they adopted that Greek culture. The Roman and Greeks, they valued a lot of similar things, and even their religions are very similar. They just kind of stole the Greek religion and gave some new names to some different gods, and so it's very similar. But this Roman influence, they came in at about 63 BC, when Pompey the Great conquered Israel. Okay, he came in, and Josephus, who was a Jewish historian, he wrote this account of the Jewish-Roman kind of battle when Rome came in and conquered Israel. But when Rome came in, conquered Israel, they put Herod the Great, in charge of ruling Israel. And you can read about Herod the Great in our Gospels. Okay? Not very much. He's just mentioned a little bit there at the beginning when Jesus is born. But he is mentioned in our Gospels. And so Herod the Great came in, and he's kind of a mixed bag of good and bad leadership. Okay? Good, he did a lot of building in Israel. He built a lot of aqueducts and temples, and he gave the Israel people jobs and income. And so that was good. Bad, he heavily taxed the Jews. He had to pay for these big fancy buildings somehow, and so the income he gave the Jews, he taxed from them. Okay? Bad, the day he died, he ordered that a bunch of Jewish leaders were also killed alongside of him so that the people would mourn his death. He did some good things in Jerusalem, in Israel. He did some very not so good things. And so Josephus, when he's writing this account of Herod, he mentions both these good and these bad things that he did. And it's not just like, oh, he was the worst, he was awful. No, he did some good things, but he did some terrible things too. So Josephus, this Jewish historian that lived during the first century, he recorded a lot of what happened during the first Jewish-Roman war. And his most important works, if you're interested, are the Jewish War and Antiquities of the Jew. Okay, the Antiquities of the Jew was a detailed history of the world from a Jewish perspective. And so Josephus is kind of, one of those historians that if you want to know about the Jews and their history, you want to read Josephus. And so I would recommend you go look at that. Anyways, a little bit off topic, but I think it's important to know kind of what was going on during this time. And that's really what I was asked to give to you. Just what was going on in this culture when the Gospels were being written, when Jesus was alive, and when Paul wrote his letters to the church. So, the people living in Israel, now that I've talked about all the Greeks and the Romans, they wouldn't have necessarily adopted everything that the Greeks and Romans were throwing at them. In fact, there were zealots that were against adopting the Greek and Roman culture. And they would fight against it, and they would look for any opportunity they could get to kill the Romans. And so you get these zealots that are out there trying to fight this culture influence, but it's going to happen. You get such a large Hellenization process, you get these Greeks coming in, these Romans coming in and moving into your country, they are going to influence you. Okay? No matter how much you fight it, no matter how many zealots there are, these cultures had an influence on the Israelites and the Jewish people of this time. Okay? In fact, so far all I've been talking about is Israel. But all of the churches that Paul wrote to were outside of Israel. And so they would have been even more heavily impacted by the Greek and Roman influence. Ephesus and Corinth, they are in Greece. And then you get the letter to the Romans, and all these people are growing up. They aren't Jewish. These are Gentile people that Paul is reaching out to. And so when he writes these letters, he is writing to Greeks and Romans, not necessarily the Jewish people. So this Greek and Roman influence was huge in Paul's writing of his letters. So this culture, when we're talking about women, when we're talking about this culture, it's important to note that the historians and philosophers have this to say about women. Okay, Josephus, who I've already mentioned, he claimed that the law prescribed their subordination, women's subordination, for their own good. Okay, Philo complained that women have little sense and praised one exception, Empress Livia, for becoming intellectually male. Okay, so women have little sense, but Empress Livia, she's okay because she's male, which meant she was up here. That's what he said. It's not what I'm saying. Okay? Plutarch, one of the more progressive writers on the subject, positively suggests that women can learn philosophy from their husbands, but negatively bases this on the datum that they will pursue folly if left to their own devices. So they can learn philosophy from their husbands, but left to their own devices, they're going to pursue folly. Okay? These are all influential people, philosophers, historians, that are saying this about women in the Roman culture, first century. Such attitudes naturally affected their treatment in ancient households where men always had the power. Roman law vested complete authority over wife, children, and slaves to pater familias, okay, which was the head of the household, the father, the husband, or the oldest son. Okay? So the head of the household was the oldest male who ran the household. And he had complete authority over everybody else in that household. Women, children, slaves, complete authority. Okay? And that was Roman law. Okay? The wife's quiet submission to her paterfamilias was viewed as one of her greatest virtues throughout Greco-Roman antiquity. So when it comes to Roman culture, there are two topics that I really want to spend the majority of my time with. I want to talk about honor and shame and the public and private realms of life. Okay, so we're going to look at honor and shame. We're going to look at the public and private arenas of life. Because these were huge in Roman culture, Greek and Roman culture. Okay? But before we get into that, I have to mention that much like Jewish culture, the Roman culture was very male-oriented. The family life was centered around the paterfamilias. Even the law confirmed that. When a woman married, her guardianship would be transferred from her father or brother to her new husband. So when she marries, she goes from the guardianship of her father to the guardianship of her husband. Okay? And when I say guardianship, there's a lot more going on there than just looking out for her. According to law, she was now obligated to serve him. Okay? The woman's legal contracts were then passed on to her new paterfamilias, and she would generally adopt his religion as well. This is the culture that the first century church grew up in. So when we read about the birth of the church in Acts, when we read about the spreading of the gospel from Jerusalem, Judea, to the ends of the earth, this is the culture that they are fighting. This is the culture that it is growing up in. The Roman culture had a very high view of honor and shame. Okay? It was the goal of every person to bring honor to oneself and one's family. And not necessarily so that you could, climb the social ladder, because you weren't ever going to climb the social ladder that way. Where you were born is where you were born. Okay? There wasn't much climbing out of the social ladder. But given on where you were born, in order to gain honor for yourself or family, it would change. It was different. A person of noble birth could act differently than a person of lower class birth. Okay? And if they acted the same way, the person of noble birth would gain honor. You know, if he speaks out in public and does these grand speeches out in the forum, that would gain him honor. But someone of a lower class, if he did that exact same thing, it would bring him shame. And it would bring shame to his family. A man and a woman, if they do the exact same thing in that culture, it would bring the man honor and the woman shame. Okay? Or vice versa. Okay? You know, talking about public speaking, going out to the forum. If a man were to go speak in the forum to large crowds and speak with wisdom and truth, that would bring him honor. If a woman tried to do that, that would bring not only shame to herself, but to her family. And so you get these different rule sets for these different groups of people, different classes of how they bring honor to themselves and to their family. Okay? And that goes with rural settings and urban settings as well. And speaking of class, it was during this time that women were beginning to gain more freedom, mostly in the upper class, where their status offered them more opportunities than a woman in the lower class would have. Women were beginning to be more seen more in the public arena than they would have in previous generations, although they were still in the vast minority. Juvenal, a Roman poet who lived in the late 1st century, gives us a little insight to the freedom that urban life gave women and how men might react to it in his 6th satire. And he says, "Do you wonder where these monsters come from? In the good old days, poverty made our Latin women chaste. Small huts didn't provide opportunities for immoral behavior. Hard work, lack of sleep, hands rough and calloused from working wool, Hannibal near the city, their husbands performing militia duty, these things just don't allow vices to develop. Now, however, we are suffering the ill effects of a long peace. Luxury, more destructive than war, threatens the city and takes revenge the lands we have conquered. No crime or lustful act is missing. Now that traditional Roman poverty is dead, obscene wealth brought with it foreign customs and unmanly luxuries and ugly affluence weakened each generation. Do you wonder where these monsters came from?" He's talking about these new freedoms that the women have because of their Pax Romana, okay, the peace of Rome. They weren't constantly at war now. They were at peace, and so women were getting out a little bit more. You know, they didn't have to stay at home while the husband was off at war. They were expressing themselves more, and Juvenal thought it was an abomination. He was very much against women getting out there and said, "I'd rather go to war than have this happen and destroy our culture here." So as this church is sprouting up around this Roman world, we've got all kinds of people coming together under the Lord's name. We've got lower class citizens meeting of homes of some wealthy members. Rural folk are making the journey to the city to gather with their new Christian family. Men and women are coming together under the same roof, and women have quickly and suddenly been given a lot of freedom in the name of Christ. And everybody has a different idea of what each class, gender, and race is supposed to look like, and what would bring each one of them honor or shame. And we see that when Paul writes his letters to the Corinthians, okay, we see him use a lot of that same language. That language of honor and shame. Does it not bring a woman glory to cover her head? Yeah, maybe quoting that wrong, but he uses that language, honor, glory, versus shame, when he writes his letters. Another aspect of the Roman world that I wanted to discuss is the existence of the public and private arenas. Okay, we all know what the differences there, okay? We all go home, and that's a very private time between me and my family, whereas I would act differently when I'm at the grocery store, okay? It's the same thing in Roman culture, only magnified, okay? Public and private life were very separate, okay? And a woman would bring herself honor by acting one way in private, but doing the same thing out in the public arena would bring her shame. So it's okay to speak out at home, to ask your husband questions, to learn from him. But out in the public arena, keep your mouth shut. Okay? Out in the public arena, you wait until you get home and then you ask your husband questions. Okay? You don't do that out in the public. Okay? Women, they weren't really allowed to eat in the public arena. Okay? They would eat at home, where they would prepare the meals and make sure everything was ready for the entire family to eat at home. Okay? They weren't really seen eating out in the public arena. Okay? That was a private event. And so this idea of the private and public arena was so different than today. I mean, we kind of get the idea today, but it's magnified in the Roman culture. Okay? It's very different. One was in public when in the presence of associates or strangers. For the most part, the public sphere was male, the private female. In private, the woman was able to hold tremendous responsibility. She manages a busy household and supervises kids, employees, and slaves. However, venturing beyond the private world required caution. For if she sought to enter the public realm, she risked bringing shame on her family. Speaking and learning were considered avenues in the public realm. Plutarch illustrated this connection between the public realm and speech well in this quote. Plutarch says, Theano, the wife of Pythagoras, in putting her cloak about her, exposed her arm. Somebody exclaimed, "A lovely arm," but not for the public, said she. Not only the arm of the virtuous woman, but her speech as well ought to be not for the public. And she ought to be modest and guarded about saying anything in the hearing of outsiders, since it is an exposure of herself. For in her talk can be seen her feelings, character, and disposition. Okay? The public realm was for the man. Okay? And a woman's speech was not supposed to be heard in the public because that exposed her. That made her vulnerable. And Plutarch said that. Livy was a Roman historian who lived in the early 1st century. He recounts a story of running into some women at the forum. This is what he says. Indeed, it was with some embarrassment that I came a few minutes ago to the forum, right through a crowd of women. If I had not held in respect the dignity and basic decency of each woman as an individual, it would mortify them to be seen receiving a scolding from a council. I would have asked, what kind of behavior is this? Running around in public, blocking streets, and talking to other women's husbands? Could you not have asked your own husbands the same thing at home? Or are you more persuasive in public than in private with others' husbands than with your own? And yet it is not right, even in your own homes, if a sense of shame and decency were to keep you within your proper limits, for you to concern yourselves about which laws are passed or repealed here. That's what I would have said. Our ancestors were not willing to let women conduct any business, not even private business, without a guardian. They wanted them to remain under the control of their fathers, brothers, and husbands. We, for heaven's sake, now allow them to take part in politics and to mingle with us in the forum and to attend assemblies. To be quite honest, they desire freedom, nay, rather license in all matters. And if they win in this matter, what will they not attempt? The view of women in the public sphere was very harsh in the Roman culture. And here in the 1st century, you're starting to see the first woman's revolution. And they are starting to venture out with their new freedom that peace is granted. They're starting to speak more publicly, and 0-1 is more, okay? It's not like they were going out in droves speaking, but they were starting to speak more publicly, and it was causing these philosophers, these historians, these educated men to be skeptical, it raised some concerns within them. And they are voicing their concerns here, and we see that very clearly. So my question now is, where did the church fall? Was the church public or was it private? Okay? I think, this is me speaking, I think it was a private realm for the most part. Okay? Because we see some examples of this, of why it would be considered private. Okay? Women, for one, were allowed to eat in the church. Okay? They took the Lord's Supper in church, which was more than what we do now. Okay? If you read 1 Corinthians, you get an idea that the Lord's Supper was more than just a break of cracker and a little thimble of juice. Okay? It was a meal. And they partook of this, men and women alike. That would tell me that this is a private arena, the church is. We're all family here. This is our private home. This is a private arena. Okay? They were allowed to speak, to pray, or prophesy, according to 1 Corinthians 11. Both of these events would have brought honor to a woman. Would not have brought honor to a woman in the public realm. Okay, so the eating and the speaking would have brought them shame in a public realm. But here in the church, they were eating the Lord's Supper. They were praying and prophesying according to 1 Corinthians 11. And so this would tell me that this is a private arena. Okay? Nevertheless, the tension between public and private seems to have remained for women in the earliest churches, as evidenced by such elements in 1 Corinthians as Paul's emphasis on honor and shame in both instances in which he dealt with women's behavior specifically. Okay, so there's still some tension here, because we do see that the Corinthian church was having some trouble, not just with women. They were having trouble, period. Okay? But they were having trouble when it came to some of these women's actions. We read about the covering of the women's heads. Okay? In public, you covered your head if you were a woman. Okay? You did not go out without your head covered. And then we get this tale of 1 Corinthians where women are praying without their head covered. And I can see this happening. Okay? I see these upper class women living in Corinth. Okay? Living there where they've got this freedom. They don't necessarily have to cover their head. Okay? And then you've got some lower class people maybe living on the outskirts of Corinth, coming under the same household, and all of a sudden these upper class women are exposing themselves by not covering their heads. And these lower class women are looking at them like, you can't do that. You got to cover your head. You have to. Okay? And it's causing tension. And that's not the only place that we're going to see tension, but that's one of the examples that Paul gives us in his letter to the Corinthians. Okay? Where this tension of people coming from all over different backgrounds, different societies, different economic classes, they're coming together and it's causing tension. Because what they've been taught growing up is that we act a certain way to bring ourselves and our family honor. And so when you pray without covering your head, it's shaming the Lord's church. All of this plays a role in Paul's letters. Okay? This culture, everything about it, played a role in what Paul wrote to these early churches. And I think when we just read these letters, when we read these letters from a 21st century, eyesight, we miss a lot of what's going on here. We miss a lot of the conflict within the church. We miss a lot of the little nuances that a person growing up in a Greco-Roman world, they would have seen this and said, oh yeah, I get that. But we just gloss over it real quickly. And so I think it's very important that we, like Doug did last week with the Old Testament, that we look at the New Testament and the culture that they're growing up in, and we realize that Paul is writing these letters to these churches growing up in this Roman culture. Okay? That does not mean that these letters have no application to us. They have huge application to us. But some of these things, none of our women today, when we prayed, pulled out their shawl and covered their head. Why not? It's very important to look at these cultures. And while it's important to know that Paul wrote these to certain cultures, I think it's also important to realize that Jesus grew up in this culture. Jesus grew up in this culture, and in the Gospels, we get an example. We get to see how Jesus treated the women in these cultures. Jesus grew up a good Jewish boy, knowing all the cultural norms for men and women, and I'm sure as he got older, those pressures were amplified by the people around him. Yet constantly throughout the Gospels, especially the Gospel of Luke, we are shown that Jesus treated women as equals. He sat down and spoke with the Samaritan woman at the well. He speaks to the bleeding woman in the midst of a crowd after she touches him and makes him unclean by touching him, according to God's law. And when the woman washes Jesus' feet, Jesus asked Simon, "Do you see this woman?" Many of Jesus' followers or disciples were women. He taught them the scriptures in public and in private, and how to truly follow God's laws. Jesus went against this culture that placed men above women in most regards. He treated them as equals in both the public and private areas of life. The gospel writers made it very clear that Jesus did not view women the same way the culture did. He valued them and encouraged them to bring glory to his Father. So while it is important to know that the culture of both the Old and New Testament were like, so that we can get a better understanding of what Paul might have meant when he wrote his letter to the Corinthians, it is even more important to know what the culture is like, so that when we see the things that Jesus did, we realize just how much he went against the Greco-Roman culture. He was breaking ground in a movement that would change the world forever. But we often miss these things when we read the Bible through 21st century eyes. It's a different world today than it was then. And it's important to realize that when we read the New Testament and the Old Testament. But I just love, and I would be a fool not to point out what Jesus did in his life. Because as followers of Jesus, as Christians, I think he is the example that we need to be following. So, let's pray. We have more copies in the back. We have last week and we have this week. If you didn't get one, if you want one, like I said, take it home and read it. These are my words, and I want you to read through them and just soak it all in. So, let's say a prayer, and then we'll close out today.